Okay, hello and welcome everybody. We're here on behalf of Just Roots today, and we're doing a garden planning 101 workshop. This is sort of a workshop to help people get inspired and feel prepared to dig into the spring dirt and get their gardens going. My name is Brooke Bullock. I use she, her pronouns. I've been working at Just Roots for about 2 years now. I'm a very avid gardener and I've been gardening for about 9 years, but I come with a lot of experience from gardening in the South in a very different climate. But there are so many principles that are still the same. And for my lack of knowledge here, I have my wonderful coworker, Avi, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, yes. I'm Avi. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm one of the farmers at Just Roots. I've been here for the past 3 years and been growing vegetables at various CSA farms for the past 8, I think. And yeah, I don't have a ton of gardening experience, but I have a lot of experience growing food. And excited to dig into this with you all.
Excellent. So we're going to jump right in. And the way that we've organized this is that the first chunk of time is going to be we'll walk through sort of a beginner gardener curriculum. We'll have some questions built in there, so feel free to turn your mics on when you're ready and you can answer those, or you can just listen. It doesn't matter to us. And then we will move into breakout groups, addressing some questions together, doing some troubleshooting. I want to thank everyone who signed up. I got a list of, around 16 questions that are all wonderful questions. A lot of them were repetitive. So we made sure that we'll be able to include these questions in our presentation. And if we don't get to those, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask your question. We encourage you to talk and communicate during this presentation. It's more of a discussion, and if you have a question, it's very likely someone else has the same one. So we want to make sure we get those answered. And we want you to feel prepared to start your garden. Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen. And then if anyone cannot see what I'm seeing, please let me know and I will make sure to to get that nice and clear for you. Can everyone see this okay? Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, fabulous. So we're gonna go through, we just did our introductions. We're gonna start off with picking your plot. We'll move into bed prep or prepping your plot. We'll go over some key tools that are really helpful to have and some that you might grow into and want to get as you expand your gardening skills and plot. We'll talk about what to grow, which is a really big umbrella. We'll get into planning and, as we said before, some questions. So I'm going to hand it off to Avi to get us started.
Great. So the first kind of question is, what is your plot? Where is it? And what information do you know about it? A lot of this is just spending time there and noticing what you notice. So if you've been a place for a very short amount of time and you haven't seen it throughout the season, you might not have much of a sense of what the plot is like. Or if you've been a place a number of years, you might have a really good sense of like, oh, that spot here is really shady and this spot's really sunny. And I know it gets really dry in the summer and I know it gets really wet that year that everything got flooded. So that kind of information accumulates over time. And your first year somewhere, it's part of that is just learning what your plot is like. Um, One question we have, does anybody know if your plants get really tall and thin, what that might be a sign of? Like they get kind of spindly and like they're reaching for something. Anybody want to go off of mute and answer that? If not, that's okay.
They want the light.
They want the light. Yes. Yeah. So that can be a good sign of like, oh, this is a shadier spot and it might not be good for plants that really like sun. A lot of vegetable crops really like sun, whereas there are more like native shade plants that aren't that are less are more accustomed to being in a little bit of a shadier spot. Yeah, and the other big questions in kind of picking your plot is, where is the water? What happens when it gets really wet? Do you have water to water with, or are you in a spot where you don't have access to water? And yeah, and in thinking about watering, does anybody know how much water plants like per week, kind of an average amount? One metric that people really like is 1 inch per week. So that can be like in noticing how much rain you get per week, or it can be kind of your metric for, do I need to water? Do I not need to water? And it's not like, I think sometimes there's an understanding that, oh, I should be watering my garden every single day when it's sunny. And there, that isn't necessarily true. There's a lot more wiggle room in moisture, and plants have a lot that they do to adapt to different environments and in different moments. And like water can be really helpful, especially for young plants, for seedlings, for seeds that are getting started, and is really important in a drought, but is not. But they can do a lot in some dry moments as well.
Quick question from Sarah.
Yeah, hi. I was curious. I'm new to this area coming from the south. And does the soil here hold water a lot? Like, is it really retentive of the water versus I'm used to like give it all the water you could possibly imagine giving it, like soaker hoses and that kind of thing. Is that common up here?
I think it depends where exactly you are. I like where we are, it's really kind of heavier wet soil. It's got like more clay, and is just not as well draining, less sandy, less silty. So it's so it can actually, like, we can be more in the realm of like too wet, can be a problem here, and which can cause diseases and other issues. But I think it's a little bit more particular to where you are. So it like, yeah, it might be just like noticing, looking at your soil, seeing like, is it really heavy? Like if you like squeeze it, is it really holding itself together? Is it crumbling apart? Kind of some basic questions along that might help.
Thank you.
I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, and this is kind of continuing along the same ideas of paying attention to your plot. And I think, and other things to consider is like, what is already growing there, and thinking about what you're going to grow there. How hard might it be to get out what's already growing? So if there's like really deeply rooted plants that have been there a long time, that, if you're going to cut the tubers up, like in this top right corner, they're just going to continue to sprout more. That might be a spot that you don't try to grow on right away. Maybe you tarp it and let those plants die back for a long time before you get in there. And then in this bottom right, we have some kind of visual examples of like silt, clay, sand, sandy soil, and loamy soil. And silt, clay, and sand are just the 3 different size particles that make up the part of soil that isn't alive. So the unorganic part of soil. And they're just, and loam is like the nice mix of the 3 of them. It's not its own particle. It's just like a really happy middle mix that's a really nice, like a really easeful for growing in, and how it both holds onto moisture and nutrients, and how it allows for like roots and aeration to grow.
I think we have another question, Sarah, or maybe your hand didn't go down from before, but ask if you do have a question.
Me, I think my lower my hand.
Okay. Any questions about this assessing your plot or kind of basic understanding of soil? Great. We move on to prepping your plot.
Okay, so this is kind of the most fun part for me, and it's also the part that has given me the most anxiety in the past. Prepping your plot. So what we're talking about in this little section is how to make beds, how the heck are you going to grow, and how we can support the soil. So amendments, fertilizers, compost, all that kind of stuff. Just starting off with making beds. There are 4 ways that I've done it in the past. I'm sure there's some other really fun, unique ways to do it, like hugelkultur, if you've heard of that or something. But we're going to focus on these 4 ways, and hopefully they are applicable to your site. And please ask questions as much as you'd like. We'll start off here. So raised beds, that is a picture of my partner just sitting in a bed, but raised beds are one of them. And there are a couple pluses and a couple minuses to raised beds. One is they're more accessible. So we had to make these raised beds nice and tall so that folks who were utilizing wheelchairs could come in and out and harvest in the garden and have more access. So if you're an older adult and you're having trouble bending over a lot on the ground or have trouble with your knees or any other accessibility issues, raised beds are probably the best choice for you. That being said, they do take quite a bit to construct, but they generally require less weeding because you're bringing soil into the bed instead of fighting off grass and weeds and everything else that generally live in there. I found in my personal experience that there's less pest pressure in raised beds. That's not always the case, but for a lot of like ground dwelling, we've had big issues in Louisiana with fire ants who just snap kale sap seedlings in half. They just seem to work out better for us pest wise. You can also cover them with row cover pretty easily. You're up off the ground. You can control the soil. Just like I mentioned before, if you're using raised beds, you're probably pulling soil from a different source. A lot of places you can get fully composted soil, sterilized soil, so you're not battling with tons of weeds or funguses or bacteria that are living in the soil. The downsides here is that they are expensive. They are expensive to build. Really good wood that you should be using for these beds is going to cost some money. You're going to need some hardware. And then also filling them is expensive. So a couple tips I have with working with raised beds that have worked really well for me. One, the thicker the piece of wood that you're using, the better. So if you use a really thin piece of pine, it's going to rot really quickly. If you use a nice thick piece of wood, it's going to stay alive quite a bit longer. You want to use untreated cedar. That's the #1 best, in my opinion, having had raised beds in a swamp. It stayed alive for quite some time. And if you can't use cedar, there's other woods that are pretty good for outdoor, but probably the cheapest alternative is untreated pine. Some people use treated. I don't recommend it. If you want to elongate the life of your raised beds, I suggest stapling food grade plastic on the inside of your beds. You can get like 6 mil, recyclable food grade plastic, and it really helps with the longevity of your bed. Now, in terms of filling, you do not want to pay for 56 tons of garden soil or compost. What you want to do if you have tall beds is you want to lay down other easy, cheap, free materials that are biodegradable and break down into soil. So that would be large logs and sticks and branches, leaf or leaf litter, old hay, mulch, wood dust from like carpentry companies that's untreated, of course, but you want to fill that up, cardboard even, with just black ink. You don't want to use cardboard with colors or tape on it. And get that about halfway full, and then you can add your compost and garden soil. So that's going to help save some money. Some other ways to grow are just simply in the ground. Maybe you've got a really great spot already and you can just go straight in the ground and you're ready. It's clear. Maybe you've already tarped. There's no weeds there. So of course, growing in ground is low cost. You don't have to do too much besides buy in some compost if you'd like. It could be less work potentially, depending on what's already growing there and what you're fighting against. Pest pressure is tough when you're in the ground. Like if you notice here, I had to put up an electric fence to keep, well, pests, goats in this case, keep goats out. But you know, you'll have a lot of like garden voles that you might be facing or critters that like to get in. And when it's right at the ground level, they're just lucky. They're right there with you. Drainage is a huge issue, as Avi was mentioning. A lot of soils in this region they like to hang on to water. They have a lot of clay in them, and clay is great at holding on to water. So drainage might be an issue. So if you're flat on the ground and maybe even at a dip and you're not quite aware of it because it's really subtle, your garden beds could become a pond, and plants don't like that. And then of course, weeds is an issue. There's grass right next to you, and that grass is going to make its way in and creep into your garden beds. One of my favorite methods, this is the lasagna method. So this method is used in raised beds. It's used growing in the ground, and it's also used in mounded beds, which we'll talk about in a second. Lasagna method is a very popular method of basically just layering different forms of organic waste material, manure, hay, leaves, cardboard, sawdust, some compost, and you layer that with garden soil. And basically you build up a bed. Now, one thing that really helps when you're starting off with the lasagna method is you lay out some cardboard and then you start layering on top. Some of the benefits for this, obviously, is that it's cheap because you're using recycled materials. It does require more labor than a lot of the other options because you're having to source all those materials and layer them and work your soil. But you can really control the soil health because you know you're putting lots of good stuff in there. There's not so much weed pressure. So this is really good in an area where you're like, I can't compete with this. I don't have time to weed my bed all the time. I'm ready to start my season now, and it's right on grass. This is the method for you. We're going to put a ton of resources. We'll send them out to you, and we'll put videos on exactly how to do this because it's quite an easy process, and it's kind of amazing that it works. One thing to note, though, is that you need a pretty big layer of garden soil if you're putting raw uncomposted materials under it, because your plants aren't going to get nutrients from those. So I just put in at the bottom there some sources that you can use for your lasagna method. And we're going to keep talking about that in a second because what I have here is mounded beds. This is my favorite method because it helps with drainage. So if you're right on the ground, you are basically creating a buffer zone where your plants aren't going underwater. That water is going to stay in the pathways. So it's good for wet areas and wet backyards or wherever your garden is. You're also able to do this lasagna method, saving money on soil. And one really cool thing about this is I don't love using raised beds because there is a beautiful soil microbiome in the ground. And it's plants and all kinds of different yeasts and bacteria are working together. They're feeding each other. And those microorganisms are what makes our plants thrive. And if we move them in raised beds, it takes a while to build those relationships. So I love that over time, that soil is going to break down in our mounded beds, and we're still going to have those interactions. Obviously, this is a bit of heavy labor, but I really do love this design. Sometimes I'll use logs around the outside perimeter of those mounded beds here, and you can even inoculate them with mushrooms if you want. So it's pretty low cost and it's better for flooding. Just like raised beds, it also offers a nice cushy zone of roots to grow deep. So if you have a really small layer of topsoil in your garden, when you dig it up and, take a peek at what the soil structure is, you might say, I should probably put down more layers of compost so that my plants can really make nice healthy root systems. So it's good for compact soils too. Trying to move quickly through here. So just one other note that's important here is that you can do all you want to keep your garden beds weeded, but if your pathways aren't cared for, you're gonna just be fighting those weeds just as much. Grass is just gonna send shoots under your bed, which are gonna come up and up and up. So really one of the important things that we suggest doing is mulching your pathways, weed whacking, and you could use landscape fabric. I'm not a huge fan of landscape fabric because over time, plants do come back. It's a good barrier for a certain amount of time, but then you have to deal with kind of decomposing landscape fabric. I'm not saying not to use it, but it's kind of been a frustrating point for me in my personal gardening journey. I really like to use cardboard and mulch. You can sometimes get free mulch if you live near an area where there's mulching companies. You can like put a sign out at your house or call them to see if you could get deliveries. You can use hay or straw, cardboard for sure. But keep those pathways mulched, and weed whacking is important too in the areas surrounding your garden. If I have some beautiful goldenrod going to seed right above my garden bed, even if it's not in my garden bed, those seeds are going to drop in the bed. It's really good to at least get things in a nearby radius, get them weed whacked before they produce seed, especially those like easy spreaders like goldenrod. So, or whatever the easy spreader is in your backyard. Yeah. So we're going to talk really quickly. I know you've heard me talk a lot, but about basically fertilizing your plot or tending to the soil. So plants, just like us, they need food, and their food is found in organic matter. And organic matter is helping the soil structure and the life of the soil. So basically, long story short, something I learned that really helped me understand the system is that plants can't really uptake many nutrients directly with their roots. They rely on helpers, and those helpers are microorganisms. A perfect example is mycorrhizal fungi. When you put compost down in the soil, mycorrhizal fungi consume some of the nutrients in those composts and produce a usable form that plants can actually take up with their roots. And this is a symbiotic relationship in which plants release sugars from their roots and feed the mycorrhizal fungi, and the fungi produce nutrients that the plants can take up. So it's not just feeding your plants that's important. Even when you're using products like fish fertilizer as a foliar spray, if you ever do this on the bottoms of the leaves, you're feeding microorganisms, which are in turn feeding plants. So just keep that in mind. It's not always just about the plant. It's about the soil life that's there too. And that's why we encourage soil practices and fertilizers for your garden or plants that encourage long-term soil health. And we're talking about the microorganisms there. So my go-tos are manure. So there in the bottom right, there's a picture of like chicken manure fertilizer, composted manure. Of course, you don't want to just go slinging cow poo everywhere because that's dangerous for people. And often it could burn your plants. You call it too hot. There might be too much nitrogen. It could burn your plants. And that's why I also like to use bone meal and blood meal. You can get organic blood in bone meal. It's just crushed bones. And I'm not sure how they get the blood. I should have looked that up. Fish fertilizer is a really stinky fertilizer, but it's wonderful for plants to uptake. So those are my 3 favorite fertilizers aside from just using compost. As a beginner gardener, I would just say just use compost. You can buy it. You can create your own. You might not be hitting all your perfect micronutrients that you need, but I wouldn't worry too much. compost is the answer. And it's the answer until you really want to get super specific and nerdy about your garden. It's still what I do as a 9-year gardener. Occasionally, I might, if I'm like farming something to sell and I need a lot of it, I might utilize some fertilizers. I really like just encouraging these natural relationships between microorganisms and plants. And so I think you can do that in most gardens. If you have really clay soils, they are full of nutrients. However, it's hard for plants to take them up. And when you apply compost, this over time, it's pretty amazing to watch. The compost will start making coagulates in the clay in deeper soils and turning it into sort of loamier soils that are usable. And of course, then you can release all those amazing nutrients in the clay. I could go on about that for days. One thing I didn't mention is you'll probably see these numbers along the different types of fertilizers. And those are these sort of the big wig nutrients that we think about, nitrogen, potassium, and why am I forgetting? Phosphorus. And so some of those are responsible for, we don't need to get into this, it's a little in the weeds, but some help with like green leafy growth, some help with seeding and flowering, and some help with having different good root structures. They all have different roles, and you can even look up a plant's sickness by how it's performing and see what nutrients you might need. Generally, I find compost is my key answer. Okay. All right. Almost out of prepping our plots. There's a lot going on here. And folks, we'll talk more about, you can ask questions as much as you want of how to source compost and fertilizers and amendments and such. I just want to make sure we're staying on time here. Does anyone know or has anyone done it before? How to turn grass? This was a question that came up 9 times when people signed up for this class. Does anyone know how to turn grass into garden soil? Has anyone experienced it, done it? Any ideas? And you don't have to share if you don't want to, but. Okay, so basically there's a few ways that work pretty well, and they don't always work perfectly well. The most intensive way that you can tell it's really intense is this first picture that says plowing or tilling. So that was a moldboard plow that basically turned our soil over. And as you may know, we want to preserve the life of the microorganisms in the soil, and this does a lot of damage, but sometimes it's the quickest and easiest thing you can do on a large scale. On a smaller scale, you might use a tiller after you've solarized your plot, which we'll talk about in a second. And really, it's good for soils that haven't been worked before. You can rent tillers. It does do some damage to the soil structure, but if you're not using the like lasagna method to make your beds or raised beds, sometimes you do need to do some kind of light tilling. And so a tiller is just, you can use a walk behind or an attachment on a tractor. Basically, it just churns up the earth. And so after I've used a plow, like on this big garden here, we come through and till it to break up all these clods. Another option, which is pretty simple, is tarping or solarizing. So you can get a big piece of black plastic or a bunch of small tarps and put them on your plot. I like to leave mine over winter, so I'll have it at the end of the fall and through the beginning of the spring, and then I open it up and the grass has not grown there. Solarizing is a good way to do it if you're trying to convert something very quickly, and it works the best in the summer. Solarizing is using clear plastic, and so it gets so hot in the summer under that clear plastic that you actually burn the plants. So a combination of the two is really good. If you want like no weeds for your garden, you could tarp all through the fall and winter with black plastic into the early spring and then do some solarizing. And then if you have that kind of time, that's amazing. If not, just doing a tarping session for as long as you possibly can, followed with a till, is usually the best. The other thing we talked about already is that lasagna layering method. So you don't have time to do that. You need to put down some cardboard and some layers, and then you're going to put your garden soil and your compost on top because you're ready to get going now and you didn't have time to plan it. So please feel free to ask your questions about turning over grass and using the lasagna layering method later if you have them. A few quick notes on tools. So you can get by with little to nothing, but some things we've found personally is really helpful for gardening is a shovel. So you might be taking out some persistent large weeds and you might need this just to like shovel garden soil onto things. A wheelbarrow to help distribute weight so you're not hauling all kinds of soil and weeds to and fro. This is a garden hoe. This is really good for cultivation. Really good for getting persistent weeds out of the ground, like docks. You can kind of dig them out. There's also scuffle hoes that move back and forth, so you can weed with those. A garden hose that has some kind of irrigation source, rainwater or hooked up to your house. A watering can for those places that you don't want to drag your garden hose all the way to. And a pitchfork is really nice. There's some stuff that's really difficult to move with a shovel, like composted hay or compost or something like that, that really a pitchfork can come in handy. We also use a pitchfork to aerate the soil. So soil likes to get some air just like us, and it really helps keep microorganisms thriving and provides places for plant roots to grow. On a bit larger scale, we have just some quick ideas. I've always used compost sifters. When you make your own compost, you're not perfect at it. You get large clumps of things that aren't ready or big rocks or something. So you can make a simple wood frame sifter with a piece of hardware cloth on the back and sift your compost through it. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Drip tape or irrigation, you could use sprinkler systems or drip tape if you're like, I don't have time, energy, resources, or ability to come out to my garden all the time. Gardens in the summer like to be watered early in the morning or in the evening, so you're not watering them in like hot, full sun. It can like burn their leaves. So having drip tape is really nice over sprinklers. And a lot of plants don't like to be watered on their leaves. They might like water to be by their root system, like tomatoes. So sometimes I even bury in like a little plastic pot next to each tomato and fill that pot with water. And then they get a really deep drenching that's not on their leaves. As I mentioned before, that's a walk behind tractor, a walk behind rototiller. So you can rent those from like Lowe's or like little local hardware stores. And the broad fork is like a large pitchfork. It's like a bed making aeration tool. They're like over $100, 100 to 130, but they're really nice once you have some permanent beds installed and you're not doing a lot of or any tilling. And then that's just a picture of a silage tarp. So you're going to use those to solarize over a different season. Okay, my section is done. Passing back to Avi.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about what you're growing and kind of this question of who are perennials and who are annuals. And just out of these photos, if anybody wants to go off mute and say who you know to be a perennial and who you know to be an annual. Okay. Well, so we have on the left here, we have beans and cabbage and sunflowers, and these are all annuals. So that means that they're grown within the span of one season. So you plant them and they come to their full maturity within one season. And then we have on the right, we have echinacea and we have raspberries, and both of those are perennials so that they either come back every year. So raspberries, you might like you're gonna plant canes and then have fruit maybe the next year and the next year after that. So they're gonna continue to produce over the years. And echinacea is another plant that will get cut back. And if you cut it back at the end of the season or just die back, and then the next season, it will send up new flowers. So there's like a tuber that's being preserved underneath the soil that's going to continue to keep for the next season. So this is just like a question to consider in what you're wanting to grow, because if you're planting annuals, like let's say one year I want cabbage, then the next year in the same spot I want to grow peppers there, then I can switch it up and I can move things and I change things. But if I put in raspberries, it's a lot more effort to move those raspberries. It's more of a commitment to be like, these raspberries are staying here. I'm not dealing with digging them up and moving them. It is definitely possible to move perennials. It's not like you can dig them up and move them around. It's just a lot more effort. And yeah, and not all perennials produce on their first season. Some perennials are like you have to plant them one year and you have to wait until you are getting what you want to get. Let me go on to the next slide. Great. So we have the next kind of 2-category question is this idea of transplanted or direct seeded. And so on the left, we have little seedlings. So these are starts that have been started in a greenhouse. So they've been started in a protected environment. And in that protective environment, it's easier for the seeds to germinate, and they just get like more consistent water and moisture and sun for the beginning of their life, which is a more tender stage, so that they can go into getting planted with kind of the sturdiness of that time. Whereas direct seeded is just you're taking the seed and directly putting it in the soil outside, and it doesn't have that same protection. That some plants really don't like to be transplanted, because part of that process is their roots get disturbed. They're having to go from like this container to a totally different like environment, and that can be like kind of shocking to the system. And people will take transplants and have them outside for a period before they plant them outside as kind of a hardening off transition, which can be really supportive. But some common examples of like plants that like to be transplanted are tomatoes, kale, peppers, squash. All of those can be good. Squash is a little, sometimes it also does well being seeded. But things that really like to be direct seeded are peas, corn. There's some flowers that really don't want to be transplanted, that they'd much prefer to be direct seeded. And a lot of this information you can get from a seed packet or from a or wherever you're getting seeds from. The other thing, like there's a lot of places that you can buy seedlings, and that can be a really nice way to go, because you don't have to worry about the germination, and you just have a plant that's already started. And a lot of things like can be both direct seeded or transplanted, and it can be it can be nice to like already have the boost of something being transplanted.
And of course, with everything, there's exceptions, like garlic, you're going to grow from the garlic seed. You can just break apart the cloves, and potatoes and asparagus, but yeah. Great. So seed sourcing. We just put a couple pictures of some places we like to get seeds, and then I elaborated on that list in a resource guide that we're going to send out to everyone. If feel free to chime in if you have a place you really like to get transplants, like little seedlings or seeds. No pressure though. I think we love sourcing seeds from companies that we love. Fedco is one of those, based in Maine. High Mowing is wonderful. Johnny's is really good, reliable, and solid. You can get tons of different seeds at the Greenfield Farmers Co-op if you're in Greenfield. And then you can also get seeds that you grew in your own garden from the year before. So seed saving is an amazing journey to get on, and it's like absolutely inspiring and exciting. There's so much I could say about seed saving, from making sure that you want to save seeds from open pollinated seeds, which might not make a lot of sense right now to some folks, instead of hybrid seeds. But either way, start seed saving. Let plants go to seed in your garden. It's good for pollinators. And it's a good learning experience for you. And even if it is a hybrid seed, it's kind of fun to see what'll come out the next year. Yeah, and there's also some wonderful things about seed saving. I think it's keeping seeds in the hands of people and not corporations or companies is really important. Food is a resource that we should all have access to. So I'm really happy there's a lot of organizations and seed companies themselves doing open source seed keeping. So having folks be able to reproduce seed as much as they'd like to, whenever they'd like to, of certain varieties. We won't go too much into this. There's dry seeds and wet seeds. If you want to know more about seed saving, like crossing and isolation distances, we can ask that in the questions, or you can come to an event we're having, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later.
Great. And here are plant families. And what's cool about plant families, like who is related to who, is that plants that are very similar to each other grow in very similar ways. So they need to be tended to the same ways. And they might have the same pests, so you might have similar issues with them. So if you learn how to grow some in a plant family, it might help you to grow others in the same plant family. So here are some common ones. We have brassicas, which are your kales, your cabbage, your broccoli, anything in that department. And all when they're young look pretty similar. This is true for a lot of the plant families. When they're just sprouting or they're a transplant, you might like have trouble telling them apart because they just look very similar until they get older. Your solanaceous crops, that's your tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, potatoes, cucurbits, that's your winter squashes, your summer squashes, your melons, your cucumbers. Lamiaceae, that's the mint family. So a lot of herbs are in this family. And like a fun trick for knowing if something's in this family is if it has a square stem or not, is one of the defining features. And yeah, and then we have the aster family, which is huge, and includes things like lettuces and daisies and many, many things that don't all look very similar to each other. And then we have alliums, which is your onions, your garlic, your shallots. And yeah, all of those types of plants. And this is just a useful to pay attention to. Yeah, but we can move on. Great.
So can you let that person in the waiting room or in the...
Yeah, I think, yeah, welcome to whoever just joined us. We're like midway through talking about gardening, and in the next section, we'll spend some time troubleshooting particular questions and issues.
This is being recorded, so you can watch the first half online. Okay.
Great. And yeah, and we're going to talk about planning. So there's a lot that goes into thinking about when and what you're going to grow through a season. And here on this page, we just have some places where you can go find that information to consider when you're making that plan. So for start, you have like thinking about timing. And one of the big things for timing is like when the last frost date of a season is. And obviously we can't know exactly when that's going to be. Like the frost happens when the frost happens. Last year we had a surprise late frost, and that meant that we lost tons of peaches and apples. And yeah, so we can't know exactly when it is, but there's an average last frost date for your area that you can look up, which can be useful for your planning. And you can also pay attention and maybe be like, hey, I think that was the last frost. Maybe it's time that I can plant the I can plant plants outside that need to happen after the last frost. So there's some plants that can go in before last frost, your your onions and lettuce and spinach. So there's things that are more resilient to the colder temperatures, but a lot of things want to go in after. And when you look at a seed packet, they might tell you when to plan around that. So it might say like plant 2 weeks after last frost, or direct like seed and to grow transplants 6 weeks before the last frost date, so that you're planning to plant after that. So this is something that you can pay attention to on a seed packet, or if you look up a variety on a website for a seed. And you could look up, like, if you don't know something exactly, you could look up something similar, right? So it's not, most basils are going to be similar even if you don't know exactly what variety basil you're dealing with. Other things to consider is, what is days to maturity? So this is, like, on the left here, we have 62 days for this brassica. I think it was, yeah, maybe a kale or something. And that means like how long from when it's seeded to when you can harvest it, when it's mature, when it's what you want. And for some plants, that, like, tomatoes come to maturity and then you get to continue to harvest them until the season ends, which usually has much more to do with when diseases come than like your tomatoes just dying. So it's days to maturity are like days to the beginning of harvest. And for something that you might be able to continue to harvest, that might exist for a lot longer. But there's some crops like radishes where it's days to maturity. Once it's ready, and you either eat it or it goes really quick. It starts to split, it rots. So you're going to think about that, and you're planning a little differently than you're going to think about your tomatoes, your zucchini, your whole beans, things that keep on producing. And so part of that planning is this idea of successions. And in farming, we do this like very exactly with a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of intensity. And you don't have to do that much. But just understanding that if you want lettuce throughout the whole season, you're not planting lettuce once. You're planting lettuce. Maybe you're planting lettuce in the spring, and you're planting lettuce in the summer, and you're planting lettuce in the fall, because it has a short days to maturity. So you're gonna plant it, you're gonna harvest it, it's gonna be gone, and maybe you want to plant it again. So that is kind of this idea of successions. And there are different, like, depending on different times in the season, different varieties and crops do better. Some things do really well in the spring, and some things do really well in the summer, and some things do really well in the fall. And part of that information you can get when looking something up on, when you're looking at a variety. Any questions about planning? There's a lot more you can get into it in this, but just some basic.
And we're gonna put resources like a planting calendar is in the resource guide. A way to make your own planning calendar will be in the resource guide too.
Great.
Oh. Okay, so our next section we're gonna breeze through is about care and tending. So we're gonna talk about plant supports, pest prevention, weed management, and just a smidge on season extension. It's always been a hard one for me. And there's some lovely examples of a pest prevention and a plant support or trellis. Okay, do you want to go ahead and start us off with plant supports?
Yeah. So this is how you support plants that are like to their vines, they like to grow up on things, right? So if you grow them on the ground, they'll grow, they'll just grow out instead of up. And you can grow them out, but that means that their fruits are in the soil. And if they're in the soil, they have more access to to wetness and to microbes that might start to eat them. And they're just not going to be as happy as if they have the light, they have the air, and they have the support of getting to grow up. So good examples of this are your peas, your pole beans, your cucumbers. Cucumbers are a little they're pretty happy on the ground too, but some cucumbers really like to also to grow up. It can be really nice for them. And tomatoes. It's also important because these plants grow heavy things, like their fruits are heavy, and if they don't have the supports, they can not know how to support their own weight and literally flop over. So that's a big part of it too. And we just have some examples here of you can buy netting that's pre-woven, right? It's already netted, and put that on tea stakes, tomato stakes, or rebar or bamboo sticks, or you can just put up the stakes and then take string or tomato twine and weave on either side of the plants, or in between them as they grow. This is a very common way to grow tomatoes, but it works for other plants as well. There are many really innovative ways that people support plants. Tomato hoops are a pretty common way. So that's just you pre-buy them and you stick them around your tomato, and that offers that support. Even just a stick that you tie your plant to can do a lot.
A key is start young with supporting your plants, because you can't get a tomato hoop on a big tomato plant without having to bend its lovely little long branches, or it's just nice to have the support system already in place as things begin to grow, just like with humans. And flexible plant tape or twine work just fine, but they have specific plant tomato twine or things like that. And then, yeah, as Avi said, T-post, rebar, bamboo, those are your golden things to make supports in your garden. And the other aspect of plant supports is also they're saving space. If you can use the walls of your garden to grow 10 more plants, then you've got the understory of the garden available as well. We good to move on? All right, so pest prevention. I'm not going to ask, please go ahead if you want to talk about a specific plant that you're struggling, or a specific pest or plant that you're struggling with in the garden. You can interrupt and ask that question, or we can talk about that later. But I'll just get started. So there's a couple things that we can do to prevent pests. Some are physical or mechanical, and then some are chemical. And so it depends on what we're dealing with. Deer are a huge problem here. So deer fencing is it's of the utmost necessity for some people, and it's not necessary for others. For us, our deer were such an issue that we ran an electric 8-foot fence around our farm, really, to keep the deer out. Some other things for deer is bird netting, on top of things like lettuces that could work really well. Some other physical barriers are Protect Net. So this will keep out not just deer, but a lot of insects too. Protect Net is sort of a lightweight, thin, clear, plastic-ish situation that's like netting, and it goes over your plants, and it actually doesn't, it's nice for hot weather because it doesn't get too hot under there, because you can see right through it. So Protect Net is a great option, and basically you could make your own PVC or piece of bent steel rod hoops or caterpillar hoops like seen in this top right picture, to cover your beds, and you can use a Protect Net or row cover on that. So those are physical barriers. You can also grow your plants in caterpillar tunnels, sort of indoors, to help keep insects from landing, laying their eggs, or parasitizing any of your your plants, your beloved plants. Now, the chemicals I'm talking about aren't synthesized chemicals. They are sorry, my dog's getting active. They are natural chemicals, the ones that we're going to be talking about today. And there's plenty of other non-organic chemicals. I'm just going to stick with these for now. Some of my favorites that I've used are BT. So I'm not going to try to say the name of BT, but BT is really good for lepidopterans, which are butterflies and moths and their larvae. BT is really, if you're having like tomato hornworms eating your tomatoes, BT is great. So BT usually comes in a concentrated bottle and it's a spray and you can spray it on the leaves, and when caterpillars ingest it, they get sick and die. It's sad. The good thing about BT is it's actually a bacteria. It's not just a nasty chemical. It's a bacteria that kills these lepidopteran larval forms. It was huge for us when we had to use them for, yes, I see squash borers, for armyworms. But yeah, it's really good for any of your lepidopteran creatures. So that's like kind of a harsh one, but it's bacteria. Nematodes are really good. These are basically, they're called nematodes, and they live in the soil, and you can buy soil inoculated with nematodes and spread it on your garden, and those are going to help kill aphids usually, I think. Is that right, Avi? I haven't used them before. But
Some like root maggots are
maggots.
Yeah.
Great. Nematodes are one of those natural but intense ones. Spinosad is one I've used a lot. This also is just a bacteria that's toxic to ants, spider mites, flea beetles. So spinosad is definitely one of a good one. It's also toxic to leaf miners. And if you want to move away from even like those sort of routes, you can use simpler things like neem oil. That's a really common spray-on foliar spray. It deters insects from wanting to eat the plants because they smell kind of funny. So neem oil, castor oil, peppermint oil. There's a gazillion online recipes for all of these things, people's YouTube channels that have been using pest supports that really work. One thing I forgot to mention is that if you are vegan, there are certain fertilizers that you don't want to use, namely blood meal, bone meal, and fish fertilizer. So there's also a billion resources online for making your own plant-based fertilizers, and you can make your own plant-based pest prevention sprays as well using like hot pepper and stuff like that. So basically the way I see it as a gardener is there is always going to be something eating something, and it doesn't mean you failed. It just makes us like have to be on our toes a little bit, adapt, try again, and then sometimes there's some things you just might not want to grow in your garden, and that's okay. But there are certainly methods out there that are low cost to keep your garden clean. With squash borers, it's not fun. They're difficult to deal with. So one thing I've done in the past is I've actually tried, I thought it wouldn't work, but I've stabbed them with a sewing needle in where you see they crawl into the root of the squash and actually killed that borer. Usually it's just one. But that doesn't always work. So there are chemical sprays that you can use for those, but I'm guessing you might not want to do that. Avi, have you done any squash borer work before? Removing squash borers?
I feel like, yeah, not necessarily effectively. I do think that in my experience, they've often happened with older squash plants versus younger squash plants. And so I think a way that we get around them is by like planting more successions of squash, which is not necessarily a great answer, but
the actual answer really is use protect net. So you get it covered, and you get it covered before they even get a chance to lay the eggs. And if you don't do that, then you need to check your plant every day and wipe off any eggs that you might see, usually at the base of the plant, right where like generally they like to crawl in, where they hatch out of. So that's get it covered with row cover as soon as you plant it is the best possible advice I have. So yeah, hopefully that is helpful.
Yeah, and I think it would be like a BT would work. Or spinosad.
I've tried that and it hasn't worked for me. But I'm glad to hear it's worked for other people. Maybe I just had a particularly difficult borer infestation.
Yeah.
Whoops. Okay. All right. Just a quick note, because we're just about at time. So, the keys for weeding, get them while they're small. What's pictured in the middle is pigweed or amaranth that is nice and small and little. And then if that grows for a little bit, how big that weed is, it just can overtake a bed very quickly, and think about how many seeds it could spread everywhere. Keeping your garden mulched is huge for suppressing weeds, and put the energy in the first couple years. There's a seed bank in the soil, and those seeds are expressed every season. And if you can keep the weeds from going to seed in your bed, over time, you're going to have a relatively weed-free bed. And I promise that actually works unless you're in an area that's like surrounded by free seeding plants. It can be a really effective method. Having a sharp hoe is really important to be able to hoe away those weeds. And if you continue to use intense pressure, like I like to put on tons of compost as a mulch or mulching around my plants, so they just can't come up through it. But yeah, key is remove weeds in your garden and prevent seeds from getting into the seed bank in the future. So deal with it as much as you possibly can. And we'll have time for questions for that too. Sometimes it lets me switch. There we go.
Awesome. And just quickly on season extension, this is like the idea of, since we live in a place that there's winter, how do we continue to have food in the winter? And one like mindset shift for this for me that was like, is that plants often don't continue to grow in the winter. It's more that we grow plants in the fall and then we keep them alive in the winter so that we can harvest them then. So they're just hanging out. They're not really growing, because most plants really need a significant amount of daylight and they need enough warmth to grow. And so even if like you have a situation where they're warmer, if they're not getting the light that they need, they're just gonna stop growing. But that's fine if you've already grown them and they're just hanging out, and they can hang out for months if they're either a plant that does okay with being frozen a little bit, or if you're just keeping them from getting frozen, so they getting frost damage. So some fun little ways to do this is you can create a mini high tunnel, a mini tunnel with some hoops, some PVC pipe, some plastic. And this is just, it's like becomes a mass of air that gets heated up by the sun, and it keeps it warmer in there than it would be if it wasn't. In that just that like couple degree differential can be enough that for those like early frosts at the end of the fall, that could keep some plants alive through that. And some plants that like are well suited for this are a lot of greens like spinach, kale, and herbs. Yeah, things in that department. It's gonna be a lot harder to do anything that is fruiting, and keeping that alive is really hard. You need a heated space for anything that fruits. Roots are another option. You can keep a lot of roots also alive.
Okay, so before we break out, actually, I think because we have such a small, well, we'll decide that in just a second. Something I just want to share for people who are still planning their garden, which is all of us very likely, we do have a annual seedling sale and spring festival coming up at Just Roots. It's on May 18th from 10 to 2. And it's a really fun big festival with live music and cooking demonstrations and kids activities and a really sweet time. But what's really special is we have 10 other local organizations coming. Some of them are just other farms, but they're coming to sell seedlings alongside us. So that makes us have everything from culinary herbs, fruits and vegetables, to medicinal herbs, to woodland medicinal plants, to like everything. All of your needs for filling your garden will be there. And we're also going to have a free seed swap happening. So it's a really good time to meet people and ask gardening questions to Just Roots people and all the other wonderful farmers who are going to be there. Just Roots, we take Snap and Hip for vegetable seedlings. And so, yeah, everyone's invited. It's free. It'll be a blast.